Tonight, I want you to step back 4 centuries. Picture cold stone castles, whispered plots in torchlit halls, the echo of Latin prayers, and a king, not born in power's warmth, but snatched from his mother's arms before he could speak a word. His name was James, the boy who would become King James VI of Scotland and I of England, the king who united crowns, survived assassins, hunted witches, and stamped his name on a book that would echo from pulpits for centuries. Some remember him as the man behind the King James Bible. Some remember him as the paranoid witch hunter who poured fuel on the fire of superstition. And some forget him altogether, a man overshadowed by the brutal drama of his mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, and the flame-haired might of Elizabeth I. But tonight, we peel back the robes and crowns. We meet the boy, the survivor, the scholar, the father, and the uneasy king who tried to bind 2 kingdoms with words. This is Faces of History. I'm the Duke of New York, and tonight we open the pages of the king who rewrote God. To understand King James, the man who would sign his name on a Bible that outlived empires, you have to begin with a child swaddled in silk and secrets, born not into comfort, but into a hornet's nest of betrayal, fear, and whispered plots. June 19th, 1566, Edinburgh Castle, a fortress perched like an iron crown above Scotland's rugged heart. Inside those stone walls, a baby's first cry broke through the cold, damp halls. His name? James Charles Stuart, first and only legitimate son of Mary, Queen of Scots, and her second husband, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. From the moment he squinted up at the candlelight, James was more symbol than son, more chess piece than child. Heir to 2 crowns, Scotland's and through a tangled Tudor bloodline, England's too, and a living threat to powerful men on both sides of the border. His mother, Mary, was a queen born to rule, crowned when she was 6 days old, married to a French king before she was 16, widowed before she was 20. Mary was fire and silk and scandal all rolled into one, a Catholic queen in a Protestant land, a woman ruler surrounded by men who would rather see her locked away than let her wield power. His father, Darnley, was trouble from the start. Handsome, vain, hot-blooded, a man who thought the crown matrimonial made him a king in his own right. He drank too much, boasted too loudly, and tangled himself in every plot that flickered through Edinburgh's alleyways. It wasn't love that made James. It was strategy, the dangerous game of royal breeding. But strategy turned sour quickly. Within a year of James's birth, Darnley lay dead, murdered under the moon's cold eye, his house at Kirkfield blown apart by gunpowder, his strangled corpse found half-dressed in a garden nearby. Scotland buzzed with rumors. Who planned the explosion? Who strangled the king's father? And at the dark heart of it all, was Queen Mary herself involved? In the swirl of scandal, Mary's enemies pounced. They claimed she'd been seduced, or conspired, by James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, the man many believed masterminded Darnley's death. Weeks later, Mary shocked even her allies by marrying Bothwell, the man suspected of murdering her husband. For Scotland's noblemen, it was all the proof they needed. Betrayal, sin, proof that Mary, Queen of Scots, could not rule. They rose against her, armies clashed, crowds gathered beneath castle walls, and somewhere inside, hidden from the clash of steel, was James, barely toddling, still learning to speak, already a king in waiting. In July 1567, Mary was forced to abdicate. She was 24. Her baby boy, 1-year-old, was crowned King James VI of Scotland. Picture it, a bishop's solemn voice echoing in Stirling Castle's chapel, a crown too large for a baby's head. Nobles kneeling not out of loyalty, but calculation. A crown on a child's brow is the easiest crown to steal. They took James from his mother's arms and sent her south, fleeing to her cousin, Elizabeth I of England. If Mary thought Elizabeth would be her savior, she was wrong. Elizabeth saw her cousin as a threat, a Catholic queen with a claim to her Protestant throne. Mary spent the next 19 years locked away in cold English castles. She sent letters begging to see her son. She never would. In 1587, when James was 20, word reached him that Elizabeth had signed the warrant. Mary, Queen of Scots, was to lose her head to an English axe. And so she did. Her crimson hair falling in the cold of Fotheringhay Castle's great hall, her lips whispering prayers in Latin as the blade fell. James, the boy king, learned his first lesson young. A crown sits uneasy on any head, but on a child's head, it's a beacon for knives in the dark. He was raised by regents, powerful lords who claimed to protect him but really ruled for themselves. They tutored him in languages, politics, the art of survival. They taught him the Bible, Greek philosophy, royal lineage. But above all, they taught him this: trust no one fully, not even your own blood, especially not your own blood. So young James grew into a king who read everything, questioned everything, and trusted almost no one, except a few favorites who would become both his armor and his weakness. He grew up lonely, suspicious, brilliant. The boy who watched his father murdered, his mother executed, and his crown nearly stolen a dozen times before he could shave. Every smile he gave, every handshake he offered came with eyes that flicked to the door, always wondering who would come for him next. So next time you hear the name King James, don't picture only the crowned man on a velvet throne or the Bible stamped with his name. Picture the boy, small and silent, in Edinburgh's damp halls. Picture the candle flickering as grown men plotted his future like gamblers over a dice table. Picture a mother's face glimpsed through iron bars and rumor until the axe made that impossible forever. This is the shadow where King James was forged. A child crowned before he could speak, taught to see betrayal behind every closed door, and raised with a crown that glowed like gold but cut like a blade. If you look at portraits of King James, you won't see a warrior's jawline or a knight's broad shoulders. You won't see a man who looked like he'd swing a broadsword through a charge of pikemen. What you'll see is a thin man, sharp-eyed behind a beak of a nose, draped in velvet and lace, a pen resting closer to his hand than any blade. Because while others ruled with iron and fire, James ruled with ink. He was a king who adored books, who trusted words more than weapons. And you'd better believe that made him an oddity in an age when monarchs were still expected to thunder across battlefields, drenched in the roar of horses and gunpowder. James was different. He was a scholar king, the living echo of the Renaissance's dream, a ruler who knew Plato as well as the Psalms, who debated his bishops on points of theology they thought only God should know, who scribbled his own treatises while his courtiers whispered behind silk sleeves. But he didn't come to this world a scholar by chance. He came to it because the halls of his childhood were cold and treacherous. Words were his armor, knowledge his sword. From the moment the crown was pressed onto his baby brow, James's mind was shaped by men who saw books as power. They made him read, made him write, made him memorize Greek and Latin before he learned to ride a horse properly. George Buchanan, his tutor, a stern Presbyterian with a whipped tongue and a scholar's scowl, believed a king should be learned enough to keep the clever liars of court in check. Under Buchanan's iron will, James devoured philosophy, theology, and the tangled history of crowns and kingdoms. He learned languages like other boys learned swordplay, Greek, Latin, French, even a bit of Italian, all flowing from his pen as easily as Scots and English. And James liked it. He relished words. He scribbled poems in the margins of state papers. He loved to argue. He loved to win. Even when he didn't, he'd spin a loss into a lesson, a line, a phrase. And it wasn't just dusty books. He was fascinated by the new science whispering through Europe's candlelit studies. Men like Galileo and Kepler peering at the heavens, daring to say, maybe the earth didn't sit still at the center of creation after all. James didn't always agree, but he always read. But don't mistake him for a fragile scholar locked away in his study. James craved the thrill of the hunt. He adored riding through the forests of Scotland and later England, the horns blasting through morning mist, the pounding of hooves. Out there he felt alive, a king whose weak legs and awkward gait vanished when he was on horseback. Still, when the hunt was done and the deer dressed, he'd retreat not to a war council, but to his books, to his pen. And what he wrote was more than idle poetry. He wrote about power, about what it meant to wear a crown when a single dagger or gunpowder barrel could end your line forever. In 1597, when he was still King James VI of Scotland alone, and decades before the English crown would rest beside his Scottish one, James wrote the true law of free monarchies. In it, he laid out his gospel. The king is God's lieutenant on earth. Parliament may debate, nobles may advise, but only the king rules. His word is law because his throne is divine. It was the divine right of kings, an idea that rattled the bones of any noble who dreamed of clipping royal wings. James didn't dream of being a tyrant, but he did dream of kingship untouched by Parliament's meddling hands. He believed that God alone would judge him, not the law courts, not the people. A dangerous idea, one that would ignite civil wars long after James lay cold in Westminster Abbey. But at the time, to James, it was survival made scripture. A boy who had seen his mother overthrown, his father murdered, and who knew that a king who bent too much might not stand at all. And James didn't stop at politics. He tackled the darkness too, the fear that hissed through Scotland's villages and England's countryside, witchcraft. James was haunted by storms. In 1590, on his wedding voyage home with his Danish queen Anne of Denmark, a storm nearly sank them. James decided that witches had called up that storm to kill him. He made witchcraft a royal obsession, interrogating the accused himself, scribbling notes, demanding confessions. In 1597, he published Daemonology, a book that stoked the fires already licking at Europe's shadows. He gave witch hunts royal approval, words on a page that fed the flames that would later roar in places like Salem. And yet, the Scholar King believed he was a man of reason. He saw himself as modern, defending the realm from Satan's servants and strengthening the throne against shadowy plots. He was a contradiction, a king who loved reason yet hunted phantoms, a man who adored debate but demanded obedience, a ruler who dreamed of words strong enough to bind a divided kingdom into one. So when you picture King James hunched over a desk by candlelight, quill scratching paper smooth, don't see only the bookish monarch wrapped in velvet sleeves. See the boy who grew up watching crowns shatter. See the man who trusted paper and ink to build the walls that swords alone could not. Because James knew this truth. A kingdom built on iron may crumble. But words, if chosen well, could echo long after the iron rusted. Picture this. It's March 1603. Elizabeth I, the last Tudor, has breathed her last in the hush of Richmond Palace. For 45 years, the Virgin Queen held England in her iron fist, outwitting assassins, taming pirates, slicing through Catholic plots like a hawk among doves. But even the greatest reigns bend to time, and with her death, an empty throne, a question echoing through every manor, tavern, and pulpit. Who now? There were contenders, whispers of rival claims, but one name rose above the rest. James Stuart, King of Scotland, son of the tragic Mary, Queen of Scots, descendant, through his great-grandmother Margaret Tudor, of the same royal blood that crowned Elizabeth. So the crown's weight shifted north. Messengers pounded muddy roads to Edinburgh. Courtiers schemed to be first to kneel before the new king. After half a lifetime surviving Scotland's sharp knives and colder winds, James was about to inherit the richest jewel in the Protestant crown, England. Rain tapping on royal carriage roofs, the creak of leather harnesses, the low roar of an English crowd. James mounted up, 40 miles a day through the thick mud of early spring. Along the roads south, English nobles lined up to curry favor, to kiss the hand of their new monarch. Farmers gathered to glimpse him, poets scribbled hopeful sonnets, spies watched for signs of weakness. In his mind, James carried a vision bigger than a simple coronation. He dreamed of union. He would bind Scotland and England into one kingdom, a single realm under a single king. He called it the Great Britain, the seed of an idea that would grow into an empire centuries later. For the first time since the Wars of the Roses, the British Isles had one monarch, two crowns resting on the same royal brow, Scotland's rough iron band and England's glittering Tudor diadem. But unity on paper isn't unity in flesh and bone. The crowns sat on James's head, but beneath them, two kingdoms muttered in their separate tongues. The Scots, proud and prickly, watched their king trade Edinburgh's stone closes for London's silken halls. The English, equally proud, eyed their northern king, the man they once called the Scottish Solomon, with thin smiles and tighter purse strings. James was the glue, but the glue was brittle. At 42, James finally entered the halls. Elizabeth's ghost still walked. He found himself surrounded by new rules, old rivalries, and a parliament that did not bow as easily as the Scottish lords had. To keep them sweet, James played the peacemaker. He ended England's long war with Spain, a war Elizabeth had waged with privateers and propaganda. He arranged marriages, brokered treaties, promised peace to a country weary of bloodshed and debt. In the hushed corridors of Whitehall Palace, James imagined himself a new Solomon, a king who would guide this new kingdom by wisdom alone. He called himself the King of Peace. He fancied himself the Rex Pacificus. He penned tracts on kingship and lectures on the virtue of union. He even commissioned a new royal flag, the first Union Jack. But while James dreamed, his courtiers schemed. English nobles found him coarse, too Scottish in accent, too rough in courtly manners. He showered gifts on Scottish favorites, raising the hackles of the English elite who saw themselves as heirs to Elizabeth's frugal glory. And beneath the fine silks and polished marble, old suspicions never died. Catholics whispered that maybe the new king would ease their suffering. Puritans begged him to cleanse the church even further. Conspirators scribbled in hidden rooms. James, for all his bluster about divine right, knew he was no Elizabeth. He wasn't the warrior queen who rode in armor to face the Armada. He ruled instead with paper and promises, endless letters, speeches, proclamations. He tried to bring Scotland and England together in law, money, church. He wanted a single parliament for both kingdoms, but the English Commons snorted at the idea. They liked their power just fine, separate from any Highland clans meddling. So the union that James dreamed of stayed mostly in the margins. His crowns were joined, but his kingdoms were not. The Union Jack flew, but suspicion fluttered beside it. Yet through all this, James found ways to bind his realms with something stronger than gold or iron: words. He poured himself into the project that would outlive every plot and every political defeat, the translation of the Bible that bore his name. If he could not bend Parliament to his will, maybe he could shape the faith that bound every English heart. So picture him, King James, pacing the shadowed corridors of Hampton Court Palace in 1604, summoning bishops, scribes, and scholars. He ordered them to settle the squabbles that tore apart the English church. He demanded a Bible that every subject could read, a text so rich, so poetic, so perfect that it would silence dissent and echo through every village pulpit. This was his union, if not of crowns and parliaments, then of hearts and tongues. As he ruled, he hunted. He loved the chase more than council meetings. He doted on his favorites, men who made old lords grit their teeth. He puffed at pipe smoke while reading Greek tragedies. He laughed too loud, drank too much, and spoke too freely. The crowds that once cheered the Scottish king who'd come to save England began to whisper instead, "Is he soft? Is he a fool? Is he good for England?" James knew. He'd spent his life reading rooms colder than any English hall, and he knew that while men might mock his limp, his speech, his awkward embrace of favorites, they would still bow, because he wore the crowns, because he signed the treaties, because he was the king. But for a boy who once sat in a cold Scottish nursery while rebels plotted and traitors schemed, it was still a triumph. He survived. He reigned. He dreamed. And he wrote. And in the shadows behind the marble walls, he watched for the storm that always came for kings who thought themselves safe. Picture a cold November night in London, 1605. Beneath the grand stone belly of the Houses of Parliament, rats scuttle over barrels, powder kegs packed so tight that if sparked, they'd blow the whole government and the king with it into the next world. It was called the Gunpowder Plot. The plan? Simple, treasonous, catastrophic. Blow up Parliament during its grand opening, kill King James, wipe out the Protestant leadership in one thunderous roar, and clear the path for England to swing back to Rome. At the heart of it all, a name you've heard every 5th of November, Guy Fawkes. But Fawkes was just the trigger man. The idea belonged to a band of Catholic gentry led by Robert Catesby, men who'd had enough of King James's broken promises. When James took England's throne in 1603, many English Catholics thought he'd be their deliverer. After all, his mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, had died a Catholic martyr in their eyes, executed by Elizabeth I for her faith and her claim to England's crown. James fed that hope. He made half-promises, soft gestures, a wink here, a pardon there, to calm the religious powder keg that always threatened to explode under England's Protestant rule. But James was no secret papist. He was a king first and a survivor second. He knew the Protestant gentry propped up his English crown. So once settled in London's palaces, James turned his back on those quiet hopes. He cracked down again. Recusancy fines returned, priests were hunted, Catholic masses banned in secret cellars. For men like Catesby, that betrayal was the last straw. So they gathered in alehouses and country manors. They whispered Latin prayers and revenge in the same breath, and they hatched a plan so bold it seemed divine or demonic, depending on where you stood on Sunday morning. They'd blow Parliament sky high. Take out the king, take out his heir, Prince Henry, take out the lords, bishops, judges, the entire ruling Protestant class in one deafening blast. In the chaos that followed, they'd kidnap the king's 9-year-old daughter, Princess Elizabeth, and crown her England's new Catholic queen. For months, they tunneled, bribed guards, ferried powder kegs under Parliament's ancient stones. 36 barrels, enough gunpowder to shatter half of Westminster. November 5th, 1605. Opening day. King James would arrive in all his divine right finery. The lords would bow, the conspirators would light the fuse, and the old order would vanish in smoke and fire. But secrets have a way of slipping through cracks. One conspirator, torn by conscience, slipped an anonymous letter to his brother-in-law, a loyal lord. "Don't attend Parliament," it warned. "There shall be a terrible blow this session." The letter found its way to James's advisors. They ordered a sweep of Parliament's cellars in the cold hours before dawn. There, beneath the floorboards and stone vaults, they found Guy Fawkes, a lantern in his hand, a pocket full of matches. Fawkes was dragged to the Tower of London. There, under the iron tools of royal persuasion, the rack, the screws, he confessed. He named names. The other plotters scattered but were hunted down like foxes across England's winter fields. Dragged back in chains, they were hanged, drawn, and quartered, their severed heads spiked on London Bridge as a warning to any soul tempted by treason. James survived. Parliament survived. But the fear lived on, deeper, colder than before. The Gunpowder Plot became the ghost that haunted every Catholic in England. James doubled down. New laws, more fines, more hunting of priests. Bonfires blazed every November 5th. Fireworks bursting over streets where children wore paper crowns and stuffed effigies of Fawkes into flames. To this day, 4 centuries later, the echo remains. Remember, remember, the 5th of November. But treason wasn't the only ghost stalking James's restless mind. He feared another force, darker, older, harder to catch than any conspirator in a cellar. He feared witches. Years before Parliament's near destruction, James's obsession with witchcraft burned bright. In 1590, newly married to Anne of Denmark, James set sail for home. Storms battered their ships, gales so fierce he nearly drowned. To James, the storms weren't nature's whim. They were witchcraft. Conjured by covens in Denmark and Scotland, witches who wanted him dead before he could ever rule 2 kingdoms. When he landed, he hunted them, personally. He sat in on trials, he demanded confessions, he cross-examined old women trembling under torture, he listened to servants, midwives, healers, all branded as Satan's handmaidens. He made witch-hunting royal policy. In 1597, he published Daemonology, a book that gave intellectual blessing to the witch-finders and village pyres that already haunted Scotland and parts of England. The book was part superstition, part moral sermon, part scholarly treatise, a mix only James could conjure. Quoting Aristotle one moment, urging burning at the stake the next. When he took England's throne, his fear crossed the border with him. Trials flared up again. Village women and some men stood accused, tied to chairs, ducked in freezing rivers, or forced to confess impossible crimes under the sharp edge of royal justice. James believed he was protecting his people from a hidden evil. He fancied himself a new Solomon, wise enough to sniff out the devil's plots. But in hunting witches, he stoked fires that would scorch hundreds of innocents across his kingdoms and echo into the next century's hysteria, from Pendle Hill in Lancashire to Salem's shadowy woods. Behind every door, he feared plots. Behind every storm, he saw demons. So he did what he knew best. He wrote. He preached. He commanded loyalty by quill and gallows both. He survived the conspirators. He outlasted the witches, at least the ones he could catch. But in surviving, he left behind bonfires that still crackle in our memory, the echo of a king both terrified and terrifying, a scholar who hunted shadows, a peacemaker who fueled paranoia. So next time you see fireworks split the November sky or hear tales of witches dancing in dark woods, think of James, the king who peered under floorboards and into covens, who trusted no darkness left unlit. Because for all his treaties and Bibles and dreams of unity, King James knew this. Sometimes a king's greatest enemy isn't flesh and bone, it's the fear that crawls through every shadow he can't control. If a king's life can be reduced to a single legacy, then for James, the boy stolen from his mother's arms, the king who ruled two crowns, the man who sniffed witches in the shadows, that legacy is a book, a Bible, the King James Version, a name that echoes louder than any treaty, any speech, any plot he survived. When you hold it today, cracked leather, gold-edged pages, words as thunderous as the Psalms and as intimate as a whisper, you hold the echo of a monarch who believed that words could bind what swords could not. In 1604, not a year after he rode south to take Elizabeth's throne, James gathered bishops, scholars, and clergy at Hampton Court Palace, a grand stone maze near the River Thames where kings hunted stags and whispered policy behind tapestries. The Church of England, born from Henry VIII's break with Rome, still shivered with cracks. Puritans howled for more reform. Bishops squabbled over ritual investments. Priests murmured that the common folk had too many bad Bibles, flawed, politicized, splintered by faction. James saw a chance. He could heal the rift. He could unite the faith under a single tongue, his tongue. He could stamp his name on a text so perfect no subject could doubt who stood behind it. So in that palace chamber, amid the smell of wet wool cloaks and ink pots, James declared it, a new translation. Not Tyndale's version, half forbidden and raw, not the Geneva Bible, beloved by Puritans and littered with marginal notes that questioned royal authority. No, this Bible would be loyal, regal, magnificent. 54 scholars, the sharpest minds in England's cloisters, were summoned. They split into companies, each assigned books, Genesis to Kings here, the Gospels and Revelation there, Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, the raw bones of the Word of God laid bare for royal eyes. They debated every line. They cross-checked ancient manuscripts. They wrestled with syntax and poetry, with how to keep the thunder in the thunderous parts, the softness in the soft. Every word balanced between faith and politics. This was no quick scribble. It took 7 years of ink, argument, compromise, years where Europe's streets ran red with religious wars and England's pulpits thundered with warnings of papists and witches. All the while, under James's watchful eye, the translation crawled forward, word by word, page by page. The King James Bible. Nearly 800,000 words, 66 books, printed on heavy paper, bound in tooled leather, ready to stand on every pulpit in every village church from Edinburgh to Cornwall. The language was music, crafted to roll off the tongue in a parish church where most people could not read but all could listen. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Simple, vast, eternal, and royal. James's name bound forever to the Word of God. But don't be fooled. James didn't translate a single verse himself. He didn't sit up at night with a Greek lexicon under his pillow. His contribution was power, the crown that ordered it done, that shaped its rules, that made sure no meddling marginalia threatened royal authority. He wanted a Bible that left no room for rebellious scribbles, no Geneva snipes about tyrants or wicked kings. This would be a text of unity, obedience, majesty. It worked, and it didn't. At first, the King James Bible didn't roar through every home like wildfire. People clung to their old Geneva Bibles, dog-eared and familiar. But over decades, the rhythm and poetry of James's book soaked into English speech like ink on parchment. It shaped sermons. It shaped poets. It shaped Shakespeare's final plays and Milton's Paradise. It put thunder on the preacher's tongue in the New World's wooden churches. It crossed oceans with pilgrims who packed it alongside musket and seed. It echoed down plantation fields, revival tents, great cathedrals, and whispered prayers over hospital beds centuries later. James wanted unity, two kingdoms bound as one. He didn't get that in Parliament. He didn't get it from restless nobles or Puritan firebrands. But in the end, he got something stranger, stronger. He got words that outlived him, a book so mighty it made his name immortal, while the man himself slipped into half-forgotten rumor and footnote. So next time you hear that old rolling English, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death," hear the echo of a king who believed that language could hold together what politics could not, a king who put his name on a book that survived empires, revolutions, and the endless tide of time, not by sword, not by fire, but by the word, the book that bore his name. Every crown, no matter how heavy, must slip. Every king, no matter how divine he claims to be, must bow to the one force no royal decree can stop: time. In the last years of his reign, the boy who outwitted assassins and scribbled Latin verses into the margins of royal decrees was no longer the sharp young Solomon of Scotland. The quill shook in his hand. The voice that once rang through palaces with lectures on kingship and witchcraft began to rasp and break. James grew old before his time. Worn out by the weight of 2 crowns, countless conspiracies, and the daily drip of courtly disappointment. His body betrayed him slowly, cruelly. He suffered from crippling arthritis. Gout gnawed at his joints, swelling his legs and twisting his fingers until even his beloved hunts became agony. The strong rider who once thundered through Scottish glens now leaned on cushions and attendants just to shuffle across a room. His mind, once a fortress of books and debate, stayed sharp, mostly. But the man who'd once dissected witchcraft trials and pontificated on the divine right of kings now found himself overshadowed by the reckless brilliance of his eldest son, Prince Henry Frederick. Henry, bold, athletic, Protestant to the bone, was everything the English people wished their Scottish king had been: the golden heir, the hope that the Stuart line would grow stronger, fiercer, more English. But in 1612, when Henry was just 18, fever struck. Typhoid, they think. Within days, the shining prince lay still in his coffin, the kingdom's hope buried under a marble tomb. They say James wept. They say the father, for a brief moment, broke through the scholar king's mask. He mourned Henry with the same obsessive passion he once poured into verses and treaties. But kingdoms do not pause for grief. The crown turned instead to James's second son, the awkward, stuttering, sickly Charles, a father's burden, a king's final gamble. As the years bled on, James retreated further into his chambers heavy with the musk of sickness, the stale perfumes of courtiers who whispered just outside the velvet drapes. He was surrounded by favorites, handsome young men who flattered him, managed his affairs, and siphoned royal favor for themselves. Most infamous among them was George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham, beautiful, cunning, hated by Parliament, but adored by the king. James showered him with titles, riches, and power. So much power that when Parliament resisted, James simply dissolved it. He was, after all, God's anointed king, and the divine right did not bow to petty assemblies. But the king's body continued to betray him. Gout, kidney stones, a constant hacking cough. And what medicine did he have? Mustard plasters, leeches, bleeding. The learned physicians of the Jacobean court drained his body while his mind drifted back to books and the echoes of his mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, whose severed head still haunted every dream. By early 1625, James's once bustling court had grown hushed. The king lay wrapped in furs at Theobald's house, a hunting lodge turned royal sickroom north of London. Outside, the land still churned with plots and debts and restless Puritan sermons. Inside, the king's breaths came shallow and slow. Witnesses wrote of him drifting in and out, mumbling scripture, murmuring political instructions, snapping awake to demand small comforts. They say he asked for sweet wines, for prayers, for silence. And on March 27, 1625, the quill finally slipped from his hand. King James VI of Scotland and I of England, the boy who survived assassination plots, the king who dreamed of crowns united, the man who stamped his name on the Bible, exhaled his last breath. No conspirator's blade, no witch's curse, just the old enemy, time, claiming what iron and ink could never hold. A church organ plays softly, the slow shuffle of mourners on stone floors. They dressed him in fine robes. They laid his body in Westminster Abbey among the tombs of queens and knights, of poets and martyrs. Above him, Latin prayers. Around him, courtiers whispered of debts unpaid, of the sickly Charles who now wore 2 crowns too heavy for any head. Outside, the storm that haunted every Stuart life began to gather once more. A storm that would one day break England apart in civil war, pitting king against parliament, father's dream against son's fate. But for now, the Abbey bell tolled for James, the scholar king, the witch hunter, the peacemaker, the paranoid poet, the monarch who believed words could bind kingdoms. The hush of an empty cathedral, the wind dies, the candle guttered out. So next time you hear those old verses, let there be light. In the beginning was the Word. Know that behind them lies a lonely boy from the cold castles of Scotland, a boy who became a king who outlived daggers and storms, but could not outlive the crown's oldest enemy, the final hour that comes for us all. So next time you hear the language of the King James Bible, those rolling cadences, those mighty phrases, think of the boy behind the crown, the child left alone in cold castles, the man who hunted witches and survived bombs, the king who believed a word, well chosen, could bind kingdoms better than any blade. Faces like King James remind us that power is never simple, that a single crown can weigh as heavy as a kingdom's fear, or a line of scripture whispered by candlelight. If you learned something tonight, share this story, subscribe, leave a review, and tell your friends that Faces of History doesn't just teach, it opens old books and lets forgotten voices speak again. I'm the Duke of New York. Stay curious, stay brave, and remember, even a king who feared shadows can shape the words that light the world.